Here's what nobody's saying out loud. We're losing. Not because the gospel isn't true, not because God isn't powerful, but because we've been fighting the wrong battles.
We've been arguing about politics, obsessing over culture wars, defending positions, whilst an entire generation is walking away from the faith because they can't find anything real in what we're offering them.
And if we don't change, if we don't get honest about what's actually happening, we won't just lose the culture. We'll lose our souls. I'm Ruth.
I'm Peter.
And this is the Faith versus Culture podcast studio.
If that just made you uncomfortable, you're in the right place. Stay with us.
Welcome to Faith versus Culture Studio. This is where beliefs are challenged, where culture meets conviction.
Welcome to the very first episode of the Faith versus Culture podcast studio. If you've stumbled across this, you're probably wondering who we are and what the show's actually about. Fair question. Let me tell you what this isn't first.
This isn't another podcast where we give you 5 steps to a better prayer life. It's not going to be us telling you what to think about the latest cultural controversy. And it's definitely not going to be safe, sanitized Christian content designed to make you feel comfortable.
What this is a space for the conversations the church desperately needs to have, but is too afraid to start. The messy questions, the uncomfortable truths, the gap between what we say we believe and how we actually live.
Because here's what we've both realized after years in church spaces, after countless conversations with believers who are barely hanging on, after watching people we love deconstruct their faith entirely. We are in a crisis. Not the kind that makes headlines, the kind that's happening quietly in the hearts of people sitting in pews every Sunday pretending everything's fine whilst they're drowning in doubt, disillusionment, and despair.
And the worst part? We've created a culture where they can't be honest about it, where admitting you're struggling feels like admitting you failed, where asking hard questions gets you labeled as dangerous or influenced by the world.
So people suffer in silence. They fake it, they perform it, and eventually they leave.
This podcast exists to change that, to create a space where honesty is valued more than certainty, where questions are welcomed, not feared, where we can wrestle with the hard stuff, doubt, deconstruction, suffering, cultural issues, deep theology, without pretending we have all the answers.
And if that sounds appealing to you, hit that subscribe button now. Because you're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a community of people who refuse to settle for shallow faith.
So, who are we? And why should you listen to us?
Fair questions. We're not celebrity pastors. We're not professional theologians with a string of degrees. We're not influencers trying to build a platform.
What we are is 2 people who've been through the fire. I have experienced the kind of faith crisis that makes you question everything you thought you knew. I've sat in the darkness wondering if God is real, if prayer does anything, if any of this matters.
Same. I've deconstructed, I've doubted, I've been angry at God, angry at the church, angry at myself for not being able to just have faith. I've wrestled with questions about scripture, about suffering, about whether this whole thing is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of a chaotic world.
And we're both still here. Not because we found easy answers, not because someone gave us a verse that made it all make sense, but because in the midst of the wrestling, in the honest, brutal engagement with our questions, we encountered something, someone, real.
We came out the other side with faith that's been tested. It's not the faith we inherited. It's not the faith we were handed in Sunday school. It's ours. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's real.
But here's the thing, we didn't do it alone. We both had people who created space for our questions. We had mentors who didn't panic when we doubted. We had access to thinkers, writers, theologians who'd wrestled with the same issues and came out believing.
And we realized most people don't have that. Most people are isolated in their doubt. They don't know where to go with their questions. They think they're the only ones struggling.
So this podcast is us trying to be for you what those people were for us. A voice, 2 voices, that say, you're not crazy. Your questions are valid. Let's work through this together.
And having 2 hosts means you get different perspectives. Ruth and I don't agree on everything. We come from different backgrounds. We've got different theological leanings on certain issues. We process things differently.
Which makes for better conversations, because faith isn't monolithic, and when Peter challenges something I say, or when I push back on his perspective, you get to hear the wrestling happen in real time.
Exactly. We're not here to give you the answer. We're here to model what it looks like to engage honestly, respectfully, and thoughtfully with hard questions.
So let's talk about the battle, because that's what this is. But it's not the battle most people think we're in.
The church, especially in the West, has spent the last few decades convinced that the battle is political, that if we can just win elections, pass the right laws, get the right people in power, we'll save Christianity.
Or we've convinced ourselves that the battle is cultural, that we need to boycott the right companies, call out the right heresies, defend traditional values at all costs.
And listen, I'm not saying those things don't matter. Culture shapes us. Politics affects real people's lives, but they're not the main thing, because whilst we've been fighting those battles, we've lost sight of what's actually happening.
We're losing credibility. We're losing an entire generation, not because they reject Jesus, but because they can't reconcile the Jesus they read about in the Gospels with the Christianity they see modeled.
They watch church leaders preach about humility whilst building empires. They watch Christians claim to follow the Prince of Peace whilst endorsing violence. They watch us say we care about the vulnerable while supporting systems that crush them.
And they're not stupid. They see the hypocrisy. They see the gap between what we preach and what we practice, and they're walking away.
But it's not just them. It's believers who've been in the church for decades, people who've served faithfully, who've tithed, who've done everything right, and they're exhausted.
They're disillusioned. They're burnt out by performance-based Christianity that promised joy and delivered only pressure. They're tired of pretending their marriages are perfect, their kids are perfect, their faith is unwavering.
So the battle we're actually facing isn't against the culture. It's not against secularism or progressivism or whatever the latest boogeyman is. The battle is for authenticity, for integrity, for a version of Christianity that actually looks like Jesus.
And that battle starts internally. It starts with each of us being willing to get honest about what we actually believe, what we're actually struggling with, and whether our faith can withstand scrutiny.
Which is terrifying for a lot of people, because what if you start asking questions and you don't like the answers? What if you examine your beliefs and they don't hold up?
Then you rebuild on something stronger, on something real. But you can't get there without the honesty first.
So that's the problem. Here's what we want this podcast to be: part of the solution.
First, this is a space for honest conversation. Every episode, we're going to tackle the things most churches won't touch. Sometimes it'll just be the two of us wrestling with a topic. Sometimes we'll bring on guests, theologians, pastors, former pastors, people who've deconstructed and rebuilt their faith, people who are in the middle of wrestling with doubt.
Why does God feel silent when you need him most? Why is Gen Z walking away from church? Is deconstruction always bad? How do you hold on to faith when you're struggling with mental health? What does the Bible actually say about controversial issues? Not what our political tribe says, but what Scripture says.
These are the conversations we need, and we're going to have them without the performative certainty, without the talking points, without the need to land on the right answer that keeps everyone comfortable.
Second, this is a space for deep theology made accessible. We don't want to dumb anything down. We think people are hungry for depth, but we also don't want to speak in academic jargon that alienates normal people.
So we're going to tackle big, complex ideas: the nature of God, the problem of suffering, atonement theories, ecclesiology. But we're going to do it in a way that's actually understandable. We're going to use normal language, real-life examples, and we're going to admit when something's over our heads.
Which happens more often than you think.
True, but that's okay, because the truth is, most Christians have never been taught theology. They've been taught moralism, cultural values, maybe some Bible stories, but they don't know why they believe what they believe. And when those beliefs get challenged, they crumble.
Third, this is a space that prioritizes truth over tribe. We're not here to defend evangelicism or progressivism or any other ism. We're here to follow Jesus. And sometimes that's going to make conservatives uncomfortable. Sometimes it's going to make progressives uncomfortable.
Good. If your faith is primarily about maintaining tribal identity, if you're more committed to your political party than you are to the teachings of Christ, you're probably going to hate this podcast.
But If you're willing to let Scripture challenge your assumptions, if you're willing to admit that maybe your tribe has got some things wrong, welcome. You're our people.
So what can you actually expect from the Faith versus Culture podcast studio moving forwards?
Format-wise, most episodes are going to be long-form conversations. We're not trying to give you quick sound bites. We want to go deep. So expect 40 minutes to an hour per episode.
If you're looking for something you can consume while scrolling on your phone, this isn't it. But if you want something you can sit with, think about, maybe even take notes on, you're in the right place.
Content-wise, we're going to cover a massive range. Some episodes will be deeply theological, wrestling with the nature of the Trinity, or unpacking what different traditions believe about salvation.
Some will be intensely practical. How do you actually pray when it feels pointless? How do you read the Bible when it feels dry? How do you maintain faith when you're struggling with depression or anxiety?
Some episodes will tackle cultural issues, gender, sexuality, justice, politics, but always through a theological lens. We're not interested in what the culture says. We're interested in what Scripture says and how we faithfully apply it in our context.
And some episodes will be raw and personal. We're going to share our own struggles. We're going to bring on guests who are in the middle of faith crises, because we think there's immense value in hearing from people who don't have it all figured out.
Tone-wise, expect this to be earnest, challenging, and sometimes uncomfortable. We're not going to shy away from hard truths, but we're also not going to be needlessly provocative. The goal isn't to shock, it's to illuminate.
And we're going to push back on each other when we disagree. This isn't a platform where one of us preaches and the other nods along. It's a conversation, and sometimes conversations get tense. That's okay.
Ruth and I have had some pretty heated discussions off camera. You'll probably see some of that on camera too, but it's always rooted in mutual respect and a shared commitment to truth.
Exactly. We can disagree strongly and still love each other. We can challenge each other's ideas without questioning each other's faith, and we want to model that for you.
Let me tell you who we're making this for.
This is for the doubter who's sitting in church on Sunday pretending everything's fine whilst they're secretly Googling, "Is Christianity true?" at 2 a.m. You don't have to pretend here. Your questions are welcome.
This is for the deconstructed, who've walked away from toxic church environments, but haven't given up on Jesus entirely. You're trying to figure out what's worth keeping and what needs to be left behind. We're going to work through that together.
This is for the disillusioned believer who's done everything right, served faithfully, given generously, believed sincerely, and you're exhausted. You're wondering if there's more to faith than what you've experienced. There is. And we're going to explore it.
This is for the seeker who's not sure what they believe, but they're genuinely searching for truth. You might be an atheist or agnostic who's open to considering Christianity if someone would just engage your questions honestly. We will. We promise.
This is for the young adult who grew up in the church and you're trying to figure out if the faith you inherited is actually yours. You've got questions about science, about suffering, about justice, about sexuality, and you've been told not to ask them. Ask them here.
This is for the pastor or church leader who's watching people leave, and you don't know what to do. You're tired of the shallow answers. You want to create healthier environments, but you don't know where to start. Maybe some of these conversations will help.
And honestly, this is for us. Because we need these conversations too. We need to keep wrestling. We need to keep growing. We need to surround ourselves with people who challenge us and sharpen us.
So if any of that resonates, you're exactly who we made this for.
Here's what we're asking from you.
First, subscribe. Not just because it helps the channel grow, but because it's a commitment. You're saying, I'm willing to go on this journey. I'm willing to sit with hard questions. I'm willing to be challenged.
Second, engage. Drop comments. Tell us what you're wrestling with. Suggest topics you want covered. Disagree with us when we think we're wrong. This isn't a one-way broadcast. It's a conversation, and we genuinely want to hear from you.
Third, share this with someone who needs it. You know who we're talking about. That friend who's quietly deconstructing, that family member who's struggling with doubt, that person at your church who's always asking questions and getting shut down. Send them this episode. Let them know there's a space for them here.
And finally, give this a chance. We know the internet is full of people with opinions. We know you might be skeptical about whether this is going to be any different. All we ask is that you stick around for a few episodes. See if this resonates. See if it challenges you in ways that feel life-giving rather than destructive.
Because here's what we believe. The church can be better. Christianity can be more than culture war talking points and performative morality. Faith can withstand honest questions. And there's a generation of people who are desperate for something real.
This podcast is our attempt to contribute to that. To be two voices in a larger conversation about what it means to follow Jesus authentically in a world that's hostile to pretense.
So that's it. That's who we are. That's what this show is. That's why it exists.
We're going to tackle the hard questions. We're going to create space for doubt. We're going to prioritize integrity over image. And we're going to do it all whilst keeping Jesus at the center.
Not the Jesus of culture war Christianity. Not the Jesus who's been co-opted by political movements. Not that domesticated Jesus who exists to make us feel comfortable.
The real Jesus, the one who challenged religious hypocrisy, the one who spent time with outcasts, the one who said things that made people uncomfortable, the one who called his followers to take up their cross, not to take up political power.
That's the Jesus worth following. And that's the Jesus we're going to keep coming back to in every conversation we have.
Next week, we're diving straight into one of the hardest topics. Why does God feel silent when you need him most?
If you've ever prayed desperately and felt like you were shouting into the void, that episode is for you. We're going to talk about the theology of divine hiddenness, the difference between God's absence and our inability to sense his presence, and how to hold on to faith when everything feels dark.
But before we get there, we need to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell us, what's the biggest question you're wrestling with in your faith? What topic do you want us to tackle on the Faith versus Culture podcast studio?
We're reading every comment, and your input is going to shape where this goes.
All right. That's the end of episode 1. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a chance on this. And thank you for being willing to go deeper.
Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. And share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their questions.
The battle every believer is facing is the battle for authenticity, for a faith that's real, tested, and able to withstand the complexities of life.
And we're going to fight that battle together.
See you in the next episode.